everything that I've learned in the last few years about the state of our soils and how we treat them would certainly point to industrial agriculture and certain other forms of agriculture. It's not limited to industrial agriculture, but industrial agriculture tends to be very expert at destroying the soils. And generally, it's the plowing of soils, repeated plowing that breaks down the structure and makes them more vulnerable to erosion. It's the lack of diversity of crops. So even though farmers may do rotations, they often, at least in the Midwest, where corn is the most lucrative crop that we grow, the incentive, of course, is to keep growing corn because you get more per acre.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with another episode today. We're going to talk with somebody about something that's very dear to my heart. We're going to talk about soil and microbiology. We've got Dr. Jo Handelsman. How are you today, Doctor?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing all right, considering the state of the world. You have been working in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, which ended in 2017. We all know why. You have your PhD in molecular biology, studying microbes in the soil and in the body and various other places. And now you run the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What an intro. Well, we're honored to talk with you, and we just wanted to ask you a few questions and see if you could answer. So I feel like soil health is a subject that doesn't get enough attention. What was your introduction in becoming interested in soil science and microbiology?
Well, as a kid, I was always fascinated by agriculture, and I have to admit I didn't think a whole lot about soil. I just thought about the plants that grew above the soil. And I became interested in microbes in seventh grade when I saw paramecia, which are little protists, swimming under the microscope. And I just thought that that was the most wildly wonderful thing I'd ever seen. And when I went to college, I was always interested in agriculture. So I checked the box for my major at Cornell that was for agronomy because it started with an AG. I had no idea what agronomy was, but I figured it had something to do with agriculture. And it turned out that at Cornell, agronomy includes both crops and soils. And what I found was that the soil science classes were really the ones that excited me. And the microbiology was the best part of those. And so when I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to work on plants, but in very, very short time, within a few weeks, I was into the microbes, and that's what I've done ever since.
So you found it interesting right off the bat that there was these unseen little heroes in the dirt.
Yeah, I think that's part of the unseen part is one of the aspects that intrigues me, that there's this whole world that we can't see that is directing things. They're running the cycles and our behavior and the health of our environment and our food supply. And we hardly ever think about them, and we certainly can't see them.
And so you said you were into agriculture and stuff. What was in early life? What led you to being interested in gardening or agriculture?
I don't know. It's just one of those things that appeal to me. Whatever makes any of us like any topic. I remember driving past rows of corn in agricultural areas, and I was fascinated by the geometry that you could, when you're right at the row, you could look down it. But if you're driving, you very quickly couldn't, and then you could see down the next row. And for some reason, that phenomenon just fascinated me. I could watch for hours as you could see down the row and then not down the row. So who knows what tickles a child's mind?
Right. I don't know. But this is like the privacy fence thing where people put up the privacy fence, but if you drive fast enough by it, you can see right in their backyard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's great. I also a big plant fan, so I understand 100%. But you talk about fields of corn or whatever. Industrialized agriculture has been around for, a hot minute, and it's kind of becoming more and more controversial. Does your research indicate that we're supposed to be rethinking the way that we do agriculture and protect, and how can we protect the soil?
Well, everything that I've learned in the last few years about the state of our soils and how we treat them would certainly point to industrial agriculture and certain other forms of agriculture. It's not limited to industrial agriculture, but industrial agriculture tends to be very expert at destroying the soils. And generally, it's the plowing of soils, repeated plowing that breaks down the structure and makes them more vulnerable to erosion. It's the lack of diversity of crops. So even though farmers may do rotations, they often, at least in the Midwest, where corn is the most lucrative crop that we grow, the incentive, of course, is to keep growing corn because you get more per acre yield and financial yield than with any other crop. And farmers live on a very small margin of economic stability, and they can't afford to make choices often that would reduce their income for the year. So they'll plant corn as long as they can and then do a rotation with soybeans and then go back to corn. And what we need are much more frequent rotations, a greater diversity of plants, and even a greater diversity of plants in the same field at the same time. And there's some work showing that that is an extremely effective way to reduce soil erosion. And then we should be using cover crops, which are the crops that grow over the winter. So they're planted in the fall after harvest. They grow, they germinate and grow a small amount, and then they hold the soil down over the winter. And then in the spring, they can either be allowed just to die, they can be plowed under, they can be harvested depending upon what the farmer wants to do. And that's really important because bare soil is something we should never see. But if you fly over the Midwest of the United States in the winter, if there's no snow, it's just solid brown soil. There is rarely a field that hasn't been plowed in the fall and then just left. And that's a very vulnerable soil.
So on a statistical level, are we losing more soil than we're fertilizing and making healthy? Are we just denigrating globally our health of our soil?
Well, the erosion problem is part of the equation. We're definitely reducing the fertility and the health of the soil, but the loss of soil is at somewhere between 10 and 100 times the rate at which it's produced. So that's obviously not sustainable. And that's the worry, is that, it's not going to take very long to lose all of our soil. In fact, in many areas, we have lost all of our soil. It's estimated that a third of the farmland of the Midwest has already lost all of its topsoil. And so building it back is harder once all the topsoil is gone. And that's what we need to be preserving.
Yeah. And I can actually confirm in Germany, things are done a little bit differently. They still have the tendency to do things that will deplete their soil, but they do use the cover crops. And I my hat is off to them. Have you been places in your research or in your journeys that you realize that maybe some cultures or some systems in other places are doing better than we are in the United States?
Well, the ones that I think we should be looking to for the best practices are the indigenous cultures that have been around in the same location for thousands of years. And so the Zuni Indians in the southwest of the United States have been farming for about almost 1,000 years in the same area. And they farm very vulnerable soils that, in fact, when Europeans arrived, they couldn't grow crops. They had to get advice from the Zunis because it's such a harsh environment and the soil is so prone to erosion. And if they've been farming for 1,000 years, obviously they're not eroding their soil, and they have really good methods to prevent that. The Maya are another group in Mexico and Central America that are their populations were vastly reduced in the last about 1,000 years. But the ones that remain are extremely productive. And those people have been farming on the same land for over 4,000 years. And the land has not been reduced in its health or fertility. In fact, it's increased its fertility because of the practices the Maya use. So if you look across all of these cultures where there are still people who are farming the way they did many hundreds or thousands of years ago, there are basically a few principles that they have learned and live by, and we would do well to copy that.
Yeah, I find that the minute that we do away with the modern technology that's ruining us all, I'm happily ready to get back to the agrarian land. I think we need to take away something from the equation rather than try to add more to it. And I'm so glad you're here to tell me this. So also the research about the microbiome, which is in our body, on our bodies, everywhere. What's the current science on that? And is that something we should be looking at closer?
Yeah, the microbiome is a powerful organ in the human body. And in fact, it's the only organ that we can replace without surgery. And that's a pretty potent concept when you think of it, that here we have thousands of species, hundreds or thousands of species that are directing all sorts of processes in the human body. And by changing our diet or chemicals that we ingest or drugs that we ingest, we can change the structure of that microbial community and the membership. So that's a pretty powerful drug, if you dare call it that, but you don't have to use the typical kinds of drugs, what we usually think of as, chemical pharmaceuticals to affect the change. There's no question that the gut microbiome directs all sorts of processes that result in health or departure from health. Everything from obesity to heart disease to Alzheimer's disease have all been linked to changes in the microbiome. Not all of them have been shown to be causal relationships. So we know that, people with certain conditions have different microbiomes, but some of them are clearly causal. And some of the evidence where the microbiome is causal is just fascinating. There's a set of studies on autism where they replaced the gut microbiome of children with autism and then looked at the autism symptoms over the following 2 years and saw a tremendous remission in symptoms. So that was kind of stunning. And we also know, my particular interest is the relationship between the gut microbes and the brain, and particularly depression. And we know from several studies that you can take the gut microbiome from depressed people, put it into germ-free mice. So those are mice that don't have their own microbiome, and they will begin to express symptoms of something like depression, the mouse version of depression. And so I think that those are some of the really intriguing ideas. We still don't know how to manipulate the microbiome to overcome it, the problems caused by, a negative microbiome in a very precise way. I mean, besides just completely replacing the microbiome in one person with another. But other than that, I think we have some really powerful evidence that it's involved. So now the question is, how do we develop interventions that change the microbiome in the positive direction?
And so when you talk about microbiome, this is a living thing. We're not talking about just one critter, or is it a lot of different critters living in harmony together? Is that right?
Yeah, it's a community of organisms. And so, for example, the gut, any individual person will have several hundred species of bacteria in their gut, all living together. They will not be the same species as another person's microbiome. That person will have a different 100 species. But that's figuring out the composition, what species are there, is one of the ways that we characterize the microbiome and develop these associations with health and disease.
Is there still quite a bit of mystery as far as who these critters are?
Well, a number of years ago, about 20 years ago, it was found that we couldn't culture a large number of the organisms in the human microbiome. And so that created a certain mystery. And organisms that we thought were dominant, like, for example, E. coli, because it was easily culturable, turned out to be not very prevalent in the microbiome, and organisms that we weren't able to culture were actually the dominant species. And so our culturing methods have gotten a lot better since then. And the biggest change is that it was recognized that the gut microbiome is anaerobic, which means free of oxygen. And so it doesn't make sense to grow the organisms from an anaerobic environment on petri dishes open to the air, because of course they're going to be treated to oxygen. And so once people started using anaerobic conditions to start culturing the microbiome, the species diversity in culture increased. But even with that, we don't see all of the species that are in the human gut, unless we use molecular methods where we pull their DNA out and study it and not try to culture them, because not all of them will grow in culture.
So when you find a new one, do you get excited?
Yeah, we often find not only new species, but in the soil in particular, we find new genera, which, the genus level is higher than species, so it's a much broader level. And discovering a new genus or family of bacteria is certainly exciting.
It's reserved, the kind of happiness reserved for a select few, but we love our microbiology. So in stuff, and this is off my questions, but stuff like kefir, you have microbiology like lactobacillus or something like this. Is this just one of the many that it could be possibly useful? And taking probiotics, do you think that's helpful? I know you're not a nutritionist, but what do you think about that?
Well, the fermented foods that many people across the world consume are some of the oldest food recipes in the world. Fermentation was used to preserve food thousands of years ago. It's thought that beer was one of the very first fermented food products, and it was a way of preserving grain. And you can go down the list. Many of these come from traditional recipes that have been used for hundreds or thousands of years. And so it's not only a preservative, but they introduce microbial communities in many cases into our bodies. How much good that does, I think, is still up in the air, and it depends on the population you study, the kind of fermented food. What people have done to create most of the probiotics is to simply take lactobacillus, which is one genus of bacteria that lives in the human gut, and it also is a food fermenter, and put that in the form of a capsule. And that's what probiotics are. And one of my postdocs recently went to the drugstore and looked at the ingredients in all of the probiotics she could find. And she was struck by the fact that almost every single one was made with lactobacillus as the primary organism. And then some had other organisms along with it. But we think that there's probably a greater diversity of organisms that could be beneficial besides just the lactobacilli and their relatives. So there's a lot more to learn about probiotics.
Good. The mystery is still going. When you talked about anaerobic, is lactobacillus something that thrives on oxygen, or is that something that would kill it? Is it anaerobic, or I forget the other word?
It's
aerobic.
Aerobic. It will grow microaerophilically. That's its favorite, which is kind of in between low levels of oxygen, but not a full-blown oxygenic environment.
Okay. Interesting. Cool. Well, like I said, I'm glad that there's more mystery out there to solve, because every day it's more interesting. I myself take the probiotics. I think get an incredible benefit from them. So I want to talk to you about, I think it's all leading to this question, but you worked in the White House for some time, very political organization there. Do political policies and science always work well together?
No, but they can work well together. So it's federal policy that has brought us the incredible wealth of scientific information that we've accrued over the last 70 years since the federal grant system has been developed at the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, the United States Department of Agriculture. All of those fund large amounts of research in universities and other sectors in science. So I think that's a case where policy has been a tremendous benefit. And it really started with a small number of people who advocated that science, was the way to improve our future. That a lot of that came out of the Sputnik era, when we, were very upset about the fact that the Russians got spaceships in space before we did. And so and that was Sputnik. And so there was this big race to see if the U.S. could catch up. And the argument was made that in Congress that in order to catch up, we needed the basic science. And that's really one of the surges of scientific funding was during that post-Sputnik era. And that's an example of where politics and policy have worked beautifully to support science. But there are also policies that are detrimental to science. We don't always know the best way to regulate science. For example, we have regulated the use of human subjects for now many years, thank goodness, after conducting some pretty horrible experiments on people, and particularly in minority populations. We finally realized, there has to be kind of an ethical code to this. And those federal policies now guide all human research, which is a great thing. And so that's an example of a positive policy. But on the other hand, there were aspects of the policy that were not the best for the subjects, the people in the studies, and not the best for the research. So when I was in the White House, one of the goals of the Obama administration was to rework the federal guidelines for doing human subjects research. And that was done. It was one of the last things that was completed under Obama in his presidency. So, that's an example where the policy may have either changed or not been adaptable to the future, or didn't anticipate things that were happening in science. And we need to modify the policy to benefit both science and the people who are being protected. And so I think there are infinite examples of where policy has been a tremendous boon to science, and where policy has been a constraint to science. And of course, the politics of the federal budget every year is what creates the ultimate budget for science. And so it's always interesting to see how that comes out.
So as far as you were in your experience in working in science, obviously, if you come up with a discovery like you've come up with about soil and about our farming practices, you're actually speaking out against a corporate interest that may have a lot of money. Have you ever felt any pushback or heard about any pushback in that way?
Well, I should say it's not actually my research that has produced the understanding of soil and industrial agriculture. It's many other people's. I have just synthesized what other people have done in a book for the general public. And so, some of those people have definitely told me that they have gotten pressure from the large agricultural chemical companies or the equipment companies, the ones that build the large equipment on farms. But one of the good pieces of news is that some of the very largest of our industrial ag companies that provide the industrial farmers with their chemicals or equipment are working very hard on more biologically sound solutions. For example, John Deere, which was the original producer of the plow. John Deere, the person in the 1830s, designed the steel plow that was able to be used in the Midwest for plowing soil where the soil is heavy and dense and will stick to the iron plows that were used before. And from that discovery, which was a tremendous boon to agriculture in the Midwest, then John Deere built this enormous implement company that survives today. Well, the John Deere company is looking at ways to build the soil now because they recognize that the plow in its traditional form is very destructive to the structure of soil and leads to erosion. And they're very concerned about that. And so it's in everyone's best interest to preserve our soil and protect it from damage and use methods that will keep farming sustainable for many years. Some people have very short-term goals, unfortunately, but those with long-term goals who want to be in business for a long time have begun to change their methods or their research toward discovering new methods.
Some people really think, I'm only going to live about 50 years and I want to go to the Bahamas, so I'm just going to do it my way.
Mm-hmm. But many farmers want to pass their land on to their children. It's their biggest legacy, and they want that land to be healthy. I mean, farmers know better than anyone else the benefits of soil health and of avoiding reducing erosion. And so like any system in any complex problem, we can't point the finger at just one group. Industrial agriculture is a big blanket word that incorporates a lot of different kinds of farming practices and a lot of economic models. In some cases, industrial farming involves farmers who don't even own their land. They're renting their land and farming it for somebody else. In other cases, it's extremely large, wealthy farms owned by a single company or a single family. There's every model you can think of that uses good practices and bad practices. We just need to convince all types of farmers to use the more beneficial practices.
The sustainable ones, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'm so glad you say that. We on the program, we constantly are weary of the profit motive and how it may kind of exploit common sense sometimes. And we say, well, it'd be nice if we could just do the smart thing rather than the greedy thing.
Yeah, I think you have to counter that with and balance it with an understanding that I don't think for the majority of farmers that they're greedy or their main goal is avarice and making money. Most of them just want to survive as farms and continue to produce food and live the lifestyle that they live. And the way that our agricultural commodity system is built is not very beneficial to farmers. And so they don't make enough profit on what they produce to always make the best decisions for the land, because there are certain decisions that will cost them even, a small amount per acre adds up and may put them out of business because their margins are so small. So we're not talking about, gigantic conglomerates that are enormously wealthy and can afford to take these risks. When we're talking about farmers. And I think that needs to be recognized because people have this idea of farming being driven by big companies. And yeah, that's a big influence. But the majority of farms are owned by single families.
Yeah, I get the feeling that farmers can become victims, though, because if they're not well educated about the methods, then they become beholden to the chemicals and whatever, the seeds and the equipment and stuff like that. Yep. And then they turn around and rely on the subsidies, which is like a kind of a lose-lose situation for a lot of people. Well, I'm glad you say that. So it's gives me a little bit of hope. And I'll ask you one last question. This one's a little bit lighter, a little fluffier. Your research has brought you to a few different places. What are some of your favorite places and why?
Well, I'm particularly partial to the agricultural environment of the Midwest of the United States, partly because we have the most incredible soil in the Midwest. We've been gifted with this soil called a mollisol, which is extremely deep. It's fertile. It was produced by many. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. I'm sorry. My monitor went off, so I can't see. The soil of the Midwest was developed under prairies that existed for many centuries, undisturbed, and nurtured a very deep and fertile soil because the plants that grew there, the deep-rooted perennials, generated this incredible soil structure and soil fertility. So I have a partiality to the Midwest. Another place that I've never been, but I'd like to go, so it's still one of my favorite places, even though I've never been there, is Ukraine, which has some of the most remarkable soils in the world. It has a very actually similar soil to the Midwestern soils in the United States, but in some cases in Ukraine, the topsoil can be 5 feet deep. And I just can't imagine digging down that far and still seeing this black, fertile, rich, well-textured soil. I think that's quite amazing. So those are two of my favorite places.
Well, what can you, if you studied it at all, what's to account for the richness of the soil over there versus maybe somewhere like Iowa, where it was also stereotypically very rich?
Soil fertility is a combination of the geologic material, the rocks that were way back, the origin of the soil, and then the plants that grew in that environment, and that's a combination of the climate and the geology, and then how the soil was treated all those years, and how much it was disturbed and how much it was treated to animal waste versus forests versus fields versus pastures or prairies. And so it's and also the slope of the land is really important, because if the soil has been exposed on sloped land, and this is what's happened a lot, for example, in Iowa, the slope makes the soil more vulnerable to being washed away just by gravity. And so all of those things add up to be what the soil is today. And so I can't tell you exactly why Ukraine soil is so much deeper, but I think it's a combination of the plant life and the climate and the original geology. It's been called the breadbasket of Europe for a long time for that reason, because it is so productive. But sadly, erosion is extremely bad in Ukraine. And there was actually an entire European movement to save Ukraine's soil, because Ukraine is so important to the food and economy of Europe.
Now we might be uncovering what all the fighting's about.
Yeah, there's actually a fascinating book that shows that if you read Hitler's letters, the reason that he wanted Ukraine and invaded Ukraine was for the fertile land, that he didn't think that the German people could continue to feed themselves on the land that they had. So he invaded the most fertile area in Europe. And there's some thought that the same has happened more recently with invasions of Ukraine. It's a pretty precious piece of land. And so I think people underestimate how important the agricultural productivity of Ukraine is in geopolitics.
So if we became better stewards of the land, we wouldn't necessarily have to fight over soil, because we'd be able to use the soil where we are. And how long would it take to revert soil back to a usable form if it's depleted?
Well, if the topsoil is completely gone, then you're working with growing plants on subsoil, which takes a lot longer, and they're slower to produce, and they're slower to fertilize the land and create the topsoil. If the topsoil is just reduced in depth, then it usually a few years, and you begin to see regeneration. So the plants are pretty amazingly good at putting carbon into the soil around the roots. So they fix the carbon through photosynthesis. They transport large amounts of their carbon, sometimes as much as a third of the carbon that they fix goes into and outside of the roots and nurtures the soil. So growing the right plants can turn soil around pretty quickly. There was an experiment in Iowa where they replaced 10% of the corn in fields with a mixed prairie planting. So it's just 10%. and they reduced erosion by 90% in the first year of that experiment. So some of these things are incredibly easy to turn around if we have the financial structure to incentivize farmers to do it, and the wherewithal and commitment and knowledge to make it happen.
And do you feel like we're making progress?
I'm not sure. I mean, soil erosion continues to be at least 10 times the rate at which it's lost in this country. But there are areas where it has gone in the right direction, and there's less loss. There's more use of sustainable methods that build the soil. And when farmers start seeing the benefits for their crops of having healthier soil, then very often there's a self-reinforcing system, and it's easier for them to make the investment in whatever methods they need when they see that, in severe rainstorms, their corn plants don't fall over, or in severe drought, their plants don't suffer as much as the neighboring farm that isn't using sustainable practices. So these practices are important to teach, to share with farmers, but I think we also need policy, and that's a place where policy can work together with agriculture to incentivize farmers to use the right practices.
Well, that's why I'm using the only megaphone I have to get out here and try to educate people on this thing that I feel is very important. And I don't mean to laugh but it's all I can really do in a world that has become increasingly unhinged.
Mm-hmm. It's great. Get the word out. That's so important.
All right. Well, thank you for doing this. We'll check back in with you in the future and see how we're doing, if we've made any progress. I want to thank Dr. Joe Handelsman, head of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, PhD in molecular biology, wonderful human being. Thank you for coming. Is there anything you want to add before we go?
No, thank you so much, Chris. It was great to talk to you.
All right. I'll wave goodbye, everybody in TV land. Bye, everybody.